Well, it's been a while since I've addressed the housing market, and I think today is as good of a day as any to give my updated thoughts, considering the news is dominated by this earthquake in Turkey, which I really have nothing to say about. It's a natural disaster. Nothing I have to add about that. I really don't know anything about earthquakes. If this were a hurricane in Florida, maybe that'd be different. I have some experience with hurricanes. So, on to the housing market. Interest rates, depending on where you look, depending on what your credit score is, of course. For a 30-year mortgage, people are saying that that it's officially below 6%. Again, it depends on who you are. You go out, you probably are going to end up with a rate in the low sixes. But still, that's off the peak. Mortgage rates are already pricing in rate cuts from the Fed, which are expected to begin probably this year, although it may come as late as early 2024. George Gammon made an interesting point earlier this week on his main channel. Been a while since I brought him up, so maybe some of you are not familiar with George Gammon. He has a very good YouTube channel, a couple of them. On his main one, he does like these whiteboard videos, which are nice. He diagrams out how he's thinking. And anyway, I'm not trying to plug other people, but he brought up an interesting point that if we compare the current rate hiking cycle to 1981 and Paul Volcker, the great tightener of rates. Even though Paul Volcker, hiked interest rates up to 20% on the Fed funds, which is insane for any of us to think about, on a relative basis, he made the argument that the current Fed, led by Jerome Powell, is actually even tighter because they have, in percentage terms, raised interest rates more, and by percentage I mean like the percentage increase. Interest rates went from basically 0.25% all the way up to now 4.5%. Whereas when Volcker raised rates, he basically doubled them, if I remember correctly. Under Powell, the Fed has hiked rates by a factor of much more than 2. Currently, we're sitting at like 18 times if you started out at the 0 to 0.25% range. If you say, well, they've doubled it, or they've multiplied that original rate like by 18, and we're going to be up to 20 if the Fed hikes a couple more times and gets all the way up to 5%, which psychologically Powell might want to get to 5%. But as it stands, I think we're probably going to go with one more Fed rate hike to where the range will be 4.75 to 5. So 5 will be the high end of the range. It won't be the bottom of the range. So anyway, back to Gammon's point. He was looking at Fed funds versus the rate of inflation. And he was making the argument that as soon as inflation started to decelerate, as soon as inflation, like let's say inflation was at 15% or something, I'm just using a random number, and then inflation went down to like 14.9%, that was when Volcker pivoted. As soon as inflation started to come down at all, Volcker pivoted, and he started cutting rates. Powell, on the other hand, has not pivoted yet. And inflation has already started to fall. It's been falling for some months now. But Powell, and I agree with this on Powell's part, Powell is concerned that the disinflation, as they call it, might itself also be transitory. And so he does not want to pivot until he's certain that inflation is actually coming down for good. I applaud this. This is a good thing. Inflation should be as close to 0 as possible, and if it's not 0, it should be negative. The cost of living in an increasingly wealthy society should be going down, not up. People should be getting richer, not poorer. What is economic growth in a world where your standard of living continues to go down and down? That's not any growth that I care about. That's not any growth that I value. To me, if the economy is growing, that should mean that my life is getting better, that things are getting easier for me, that there's more plentiful things for me and my family. And so as a result, when the next recession begins, it's going to end up being more painful than it otherwise would have been if Powell was already cutting. And so I hope this is the case. The deeper the crash, the better off it will be for all of us who don't own assets currently. Now, what does all this have to do with the housing market? Well, housing, as you all know, is one of the most overvalued assets in our present bubble economy. It's what offends me most about the status quo. It's one thing if stocks are overvalued and overpriced. I mean, that doesn't really hurt anyone for stocks to be ridiculously overvalued, except for, people who are dumb and buy stocks at the top and then, suffer a lot of losses on the crash. But again, that's on you. If you choose to speculate in the stock market and then you get burned, you kind of got it coming. Would I prefer that the stock market be not so manipulated to where those big drops don't happen? Of course I would. But it's not something that I'm really looking to start a war over. Now, housing, on the other hand, affects everyone. Everyone needs somewhere to live. And so when they use their financialization tools to make housing unaffordable, to make housing a speculative asset just like the stock market, one which must always go up, that's a problem for everyone. And so because of that, I want to see the Fed do everything in its power, of course unintentionally, because the Fed never intentionally crashes asset prices. The Fed wants asset prices to go up and up forever. But if what they're currently doing is going to cause a lot of pain, I'm all for it, because pain in the eyes of Wall Street is bliss as far as young prospective homeowners are concerned. And frankly, even people who have lived in their homes for a long time and bought them well, and bought them at a good price, housing prices are golden handcuffs. If you've got this massively overpriced house, sure, you could sell it, but then where are you going to live? Everywhere is overvalued. So it doesn't matter if your $100,000 house is now worth $500,000, because if you sell it, all you're going to be able to buy is another $500,000 house that really should be priced at $100,000. And so if you paid $100,000 for your house and the market rate goes back down to $100,000, you haven't lost anything. And if you want to move, guess what? Another house is cheap. And for those people who overpaid for their house and end up underwater, strategic default is not such a bad strategy. That is, unless, you like your house, you can afford your payment, and you plan on living there for a long time, then it doesn't matter if you're underwater. Because of inflation, eventually you'll be back above water. Congratulations, because inflation always goes up. But what shouldn't go up is the inflation-adjusted price for a home relative to median income. Housing prices adjusted for inflation ought to stay the same, just like they did for all of the 20th century. And it's insane to me, because this is such an easy argument to make, that there's not like one politician who's made this their niche and said, hey, look at this chart of housing prices across the 20th century, and look at how this chart of housing prices from the 21st century. Obviously, it would be better for the whole of society for housing prices to look like the first chart, to look like the 20th century, to look flat. Because at the end of the day, nobody's going to make money. A house is not an investment. It should never be viewed that way, unless you're investing in it to produce income. That's another thing entirely. What I'm saying is a speculative asset. You're buying a house because the price is going to go up, and then you're going to sell it when it's higher. That might be somewhat viable if you own multiple houses, and you're looking to sell that house and buy something else. But if you own one house, like 99.9% of homeowners, you own one house, and the value of housing goes up, and oh wow, look at all this equity I now have in my house, it doesn't matter to you. It doesn't help you, because you sell that house, and guess what? A comparable house is going to cost you just as much. You can say, oh, well, I could sell my big house and downsize, though. Yeah, well, you're probably going to pay as much or more for whatever you're downsizing into as you originally did for your big house. Because it's the price of everything that goes up. You know, this is the problem with inflation, is that when everything goes up evenly, it doesn't have any impact. The only way that, you know, the inflation of any price helps anybody is if only the prices of certain goods and commodities goes up, or that it goes up at disparate rates, and if you are the holder of something that is rising faster than the prices of everything else. And so I truly think that the pricing the average person out of a home is one of the greatest evils of modern America, because shelter is one of the most basic needs. You know, in a country where we have a massive homelessness problem, do we really need to be making it unaffordable for people to own a home? Is that even a question? Who's on the other side of this issue? The question is nobody, or the answer is nobody. But there's also nobody on this side, on my side of the issue. Nobody talks about it. They just pretend that, oh, this is just it's just an act of God, or it's forces of nature. It's not. It's deliberate, and it's man-made. People cry about man-made climate change, yet they don't bat an eyelash at the fact that other men, other human beings, men and women, are keeping them homeless, or at the very least keeping them from owning a home, forcing them to rent. But rent is skyrocketed so much, obviously, because people can't afford houses, more people have to rent. But I guess the younger generations are fine with owning nothing. In fact, they're happy owning nothing if it means, working towards this abstract idea of, saving the planet. And you know what? They will be saving the planet. They'll be saving the planet for the billionaires. Literally, because if they empty out the rest of us and none of us can afford to own any property, then we'll all be rounded up and put into ghettos like cattle, and kept there while they run around gallivanting on their safaris and their fox hunts and whatever else it is that the rich like to engage in when they're immersed in nature. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.